Welcome to Conversations with the Authors.
Welcome back to Conversations with the Authors. I'm your host, Daniel.
And I'm Daryl.
And I'm Sandra.
And thank you for pressing the play button. And thank you to Alexander Nakarada for the intro. As always, it's always enjoyed. And he writes a number of musics in different genres. Today, we're going to talk about writing for different genres. With me, as always, are Daryl and Sandra Troop, who are the writers of the highly rated, Eric Hoffer-nominated How Nicholas Became Santa Claus. Daryl, Sandy, so if you're going to write, do you have to stay in your genre?
You don't, actually. You know, and because I tell you, a lot of authors have a wide-ranging imagination, and they stick to their favorite genre, but they may have another that they're interested in exploring. And a lot of writers do that. So no, you don't have to stick to your given genre.
There are some things that you may want to write in one genre that you cannot write in your genre.
And speaking of having wanting to write about different things that you might want to talk about, that includes your experiences that you might want to share in some way, shape, or form within your stories. Because writing outside of your genre, at least in my opinion, offers versatility. And it can keep you from being bored with what you're doing, I think, too.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like stretching your muscles, you know? You stretch your brain out, you try something new, and you get your lobes to think about other things. I think that's helpful. It really stretches and exercises you, you know, because you explore a different genre, and you see how interesting you can get. You know, a lot of writers do that.
Now, let's say you're a fantasy fiction sci-fi writer, and you've decided that you want to change up your genre and maybe go into romance, or maybe you want to go into action. Sandy, you are really good with, emotion and putting characters together in your fantasy fiction. So drawing on your experiences with romance, with how to, perpetuate that within your marriage and with those that you've seen around you, that might help you in writing in a new genre, correct?
It would.
And Daryl, your opinions on writing outside your genre in terms of, like, let's say you're a sci-fi fantasy writer who's highly rated and has an Eric Hoffer nominated book, but you decide you want to, let's say you want to write action. And like you said, it's like a muscle, right?
Yeah.
But also, I think it helps challenge us.
You know,
as well.
I'll tell you, I like fantasy science fiction, but I have a cousin who was a stand-up comedian, and just as a writer, I would write some of his comedy. So, and that was just real joy. It was just joy, pure joy. And a lot of writers do that. They write other things. It's just like when you think of Ian Fleming, for instance. Who do you think of? You think of James Bond, 007.
Right.
But you know what he wrote? He wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang.
Right. Right. Not quite the Bond car.
Nothing close to a Bond film.
Right. And I think that's great because it challenges you as an author to write out, obviously to write outside your box, but you're so familiar with writing sci-fi fantasy, and you're so familiar with writing in a particular way, it forces you to be different, and then it forces you to then think different, come up with different problems and different solutions and different characters that you ordinarily wouldn't write. And I think in the end, and it may make you a better writer, unless you're like a director like Ed Wood, maybe not quite as great, but I think that's important. So
it can show your versatility, when you write in a different genre. It's kind of like, I guess, like Ray Bradbury, for instance, the writer who did Fahrenheit 451. You know, on his side gig, he would write mystery and fantasy. You know, so I think it just stretched that muscle, you know, the brain, and that helps. It helps you become more creative and think in at different depths.
So, I mean, I guess we kind of touched upon it a little bit, but what one might motivate an author to write in a new genre?
Well,
go on, Sandy. What do you think?
Sometimes you just want to do. You want to stretch. You want to have a character do something that you wouldn't normally feel comfortable doing, or you want your characters to be super sweet and nice, and you know that they're real vicious and malicious and
you know. I think it's part of the character of human beings to be novel. We like to do novel things. I mean, you don't eat peach pie every night. You want to change that up. You don't jog down the same street all the time. We like novelty. We like to change things up, stretch things out. You know, it's just part of what we do. Stephen King, for instance, you know, he wrote The Shining. He wrote It. He wrote a lot of horror.
Right.
You know, but he also wrote the Dark Tower Tower series too, as well. It's fantasy.
And I think to myself, you know, does an author write into a new genre? Do you go from comedy to romance, or from romance to action, thriller? Do you do it because you want to, or do you do it because your audience is clamoring for something new? And I think it's a little bit of both sometimes with authors. I think first and foremost, you have to be willing to write in that genre. You have to be willing to do something new. Because if you're just doing it because your audience says, hey, you should write this, I think you can mess up. And it reminds me of Frank Sinatra. He talked about writing songs, and you have to be careful writing songs, because if you publish a song that you don't like, it may become a hit, and now you're hearing it all the time.
Right.
You know?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's what he felt about My Way.
Right.
Anyway, which we think is a great song.
Which is one of my very favorite songs.
You have to figure out what your purpose for writing, for changing is.
Right.
I mean, you may be trying to break a writer's block, or
that's good.
Right.
Or you may be just bored with a character and you want to see, well, what would happen with this character. And my first experience with changing genres, my father was a photo retoucher, and he wrote some of the very technical, how do you mix the colors, how do you make people skinny,
right.
And I walked in on him once, and he was writing his
nobody can see
his my arm is wavy because I can't remember what the name
Funny
of the
thing about
paper
audio
was. and he was cracking up, and I said, "What's so funny?" And he says, "Well, I got stuck. So I'm trying to have Elmer Fudd." Elmer Fudd.
We're going to tell him
clearly
Flood now.
avoiding copyright
That's
as
the
well.
brother of Elmer Fudd, by the way. Okay.
Elmer Fudd
Second cousin twice removed.
explained to Bugs Bunny
You did, Webby.
how to apply layers of emulsion.
Right. Yeah.
And he just couldn't. He was laughing so hard he had tears running down from his face. And then the next day, he was able to finish his paper.
Yeah, I laugh about color mixing all the time.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's hilarious. Yeah, it's one of those untouched gems of comedy.
Right.
The interesting thing about writing outside your genre, one of the things that, like you talk about writer's block, is understanding that the genre in which you write has a sort of a preset idea of rules, of structure. And when you go from, say, sci-fi fantasy into action, a comedy, or a thriller, there's a different expectation for the audience in writing your story. And I think, in my opinion, Daryl, and you can hop in on this if you have a thought on how to overcome that, is to really pay attention to, what seems to be the commonality when you're reading or watching thrillers or comedies or romance, because there's always sort of an A, B, C to it. There's always something that's, you've got to have this, you got to have that, you got to have the other thing.
There's some basic tenets to writing in the first place, and a lot of that's is illustrated in some of the writing cards that you can buy, and programs that you can use, and in the classic writers, they have their heroes and their villains and their sidekicks and their people who are the main characters. They've got people who are skeptics. All of these things, and these are characters that fit into almost any story. But it's just a matter of what you're writing. It's just like Agatha Christie, who did a lot of the Hercule Poirot movies, and Murder on Orient Express and all that. Well, her side gig was romance novels, which is completely different than you'd expect. And Michael Crichton, for instance, who we know of Jurassic Park and Andromeda Strain, he did his side gig was historical fiction. He did The Great Train Robbery.
Sandy, you are a lyricist and you are a poet, and writing this novel was sort of stepping into a new genre for you. How did you adapt to that new structure when it came to writing How Nicholas Became Santa Claus?
It was a lot of give and take, practicing. It was trying to find how to write the story, and going from poetry to music, and music to poetry, and music to kiddie stories.
Right.
When you guys came along and you needed entertaining, I had to tell you a lot of stories.
Well, then also to make sure that this was not a kiddie story, and Daryl, you are a sci-fi writer. That's your preferred genre. So mixing fantasy with Sandy in How Nicholas Became Santa Claus, what was your approach to it? How did you sort of conform to the new genre, and did you have to adapt to new techniques and styles or ways of thinking?
This story is considered science fiction fantasy. I was always into science fiction. And when I read what she had written in the fantasy realm, it intrigued me, and I just knew that these things would fit together like a cake and ice cream. So I just knew it was going to work, And you said she was a lyricist, and she's a great lyricist, but it's just like the very famous writer of a century ago. It's kind of an example of somebody who, not a lyricist but a poet, for instance, in the last century before last. He was a poet and a playwright, and that was Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde wrote a lot of poems. He wrote a lot of plays, but he only wrote one book his entire life. In the 1890s, the Picture of Dorian Gray was written. And so he really changed genres. He went from playwriting and poems to writing a classic novel.
Wow.
A novel that explored a lot of themes of morality and hedonistic lifestyle, all that. So it was.
And even now you see it, hinted at and examined in modern media. In all shapes and forms. What sort of lessons did you take away from switching genre and having to sort of adapt to this new thing called novel writing?
It can be fun. That's what I learned from it. It can be fun.
It is fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's fun to use your imagination, and it's fun to go places where you've never gone before. with your characters and with your thinking process. It's fun.
Yeah. What's your spaceship?
Think of
Boldly go.
Think of it like playing.
Yeah.
How many adults get to play?
Right.
Authors get to play.
So, what advice would you have for new authors and some of our new listeners who want to be writers, who want to write outside their genres, and how to writing outside of their comfort zone?
Explore it. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to explore it. Try something new. It's like putting on a new suit sometimes. It might feel good. You might like it. So, you expand your abilities and your techniques, and you learn some things. You might even learn some new words.
Right. And I think also take into consideration some of your personal interests. Why did you get into writing? What is it that made you think, hey, maybe I should try writing this? Whether you're looking at the stars, or you've seen some strange insect somewhere, or you saw some shadow do some strange side eye maneuver, and you're trying to figure out what that was.
It's almost not a matter of will sometimes, right, to write. It's whatever strikes your fancy.
Yeah. And a lot of things that I do, sometimes I'll write outside of my genre, or I'll write something that is not, dedicated to something that I want to add into a story or a script, just for the exercise of it. Come up with a random scenario and write it. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be, complex. It, has a beginning, a middle, and end, which are the main components of any good story. So there's a beginning, a middle, and an end somewhere. Yeah. Free write.
Make sure you have a plot.
Right. Yes, there's a plot. Poets have a thing called free verse, where instead of trying to rhyme and have this iambic pentameter and get things melodically flowing, just write. Just put the pen down and keep going, and at the end read it and see what you have. And I think sometimes that's the best way to go when it comes to exercising writing outside of genre before you really start getting into the inkwell.
There's a fair amount of alliteration, in writing, to make things flow. Not so poetically that somebody's going to confuse your story with a poem, but to give it a nice flow, so that as you read it, it fills in, it satisfies you, as you read it.
Right.
It doesn't feel bumpy, lumpy. It's got to be smooth.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it helps picturing actors that you like to see and write for the actors. Yeah. I had a teacher in my writing class, and he came in with this boatload of golden books, and then he said, write down your 2 favorite actors, and then he'd put this completely opposite golden book on the table, and he'd say, now tell me this story as if Humphrey Bogart and
right.
Well, you know what, and that's a good idea. I like that, and I do that. I think what it helps you do is maintain some consistency in your character's personality.
Right.
When I might write something funny, as a matter of fact, I am writing some stuff that's funny, and actually, in my mind as I'm writing, I've got Kevin Hart in my mind. Now, you may never even see this.
Right.
But I want to keep a character consistency.
Right.
I might have a dramatic actor that I keep that type of personality consistency.
Yeah, it's good to have actors in mind. It allows you to have sort of a form to build around.
Right, because you don't want your character's personality to start to drift.
Right. I don't want to start off with Daniel Day-Lewis and then end with Christopher Lloyd
or Jerry Lewis.
Right. It's a dramatic difference.
Right. Right.
In character and style and look.
Yeah,
and
to maintain a
reaction.
consistency. So, and you might even know someone in your own life,
Yes.
whose character you can use to maintain consistency in your character's profile as you go.
Right. And you can get examples of this consistency and this story writing and all of this expertise in how Nicholas became Santa Claus. You can visit our Facebook page at Troop Books. You can visit our TikTok at Troop Books, our Instagram at Troop Books, where you'll find a link to the Ewing's Publishing, where you can pick up a cover of the hardcover or the softcover book. Read it. Enjoy it. Let us know what you think about it. And hopefully next time, if TikTok has not been banned, we will talk to you next time on Conversations with the Authors.